Hello, everybody. Welcome to this presentation on some polling data that Global Progress has done on G7 countries and Australia, looking at their hopes for sort of what a post-COVID politics will be, the lessons learned from the pandemic and the priorities for recovery. I'm Matt Brown. I'm the founder of Global Progress, and I worked in partnership with my colleague and fellow presenter here, Marcus Roberts, who is from YouGov, who conducted all of the field work. If we skip quickly to the next slide, let me tell you just a little bit about the methodology that we have used. This was an online poll. The samples ranged from just over 2,000 to over 1,000 in each of the countries. These are all nationally representative samples, and they're also politically representative samples in all countries, save for Australia and Japan. I'm quickly now, as we move to the next slide, just going to tell you a little bit about what we saw, the sort of major findings or our major takeaways. And as I say, these are very just top line findings really that we're going to share with you today. And if you'd be interested in getting a deeper dive and learning more about the data, then please don't hesitate to contact either Marcus or I. But one finding that we feel is that sort of people say that they have learned a great deal about themselves and the society during the pandemic. And in some ways they will and hope for progressive ends. Unfortunately for progressive parties, that doesn't always mean or doesn't always translate into them supporting the policies or the means needed to achieve those ends. In our view, there is somewhat of a disconnect between the ambitions that people have for a greener and fairer and more equal and inclusive society in the future and the kind of policies and the politics they are prepared to support. We look forward to digging into this data in more detail with many of you who will be participating in the Progressive Governance Summit. And we're also really very grateful for Das Progressive Zentrum for affording us the opportunity to share these initial findings with you now. Over to you, Marcus.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thanks to Das Progressive Zentrum for affording us this chance. I'm Marcus Roberts, the Chief of Public Data and International Politics for YouGov, and I'm going to very quickly and very briefly try to take you through a 12,000 person sample poll in 7 G7 countries plus Australia, which contains thousands of data points. So there's a great deal of rich data to get into, but let's just look at some of the headline findings that we have there. First slide, please. So there's optimism in the new world. The future is bright for young Americans, Canadians, and Australians, but there's some real concerns that countries are heading in the wrong direction. For example, look at that wrong track number for Germany. A remarkable 52% of Germans concerned that their country is heading in the wrong direction. Next slide, please. Whither Democracy. While the idea of democracy is popular, people think it works less well in practice. This is something as a theme we see again and again. People often quite like the concepts that we're asking them about. They like the values. They like the idea of democracy. They think that climate change is an important issue. When it comes to whether or not we're being successful in maintaining our democracy or they're being successful in combating climate change, there's a lot more pessimism. And so that how is democracy working in your country number from across the range, 41% badly, that's very concerning indeed. The next slide, please. Rising authoritarianism. A significant minority have sympathy for an authoritarian ideal. What does that mean? It means that voters increasingly want, in significant numbers, someone who's a strong leader, not prepared to be held back by conventions or opposition politicians in order to make change happen. And I think this speaks to the wider problem of our political economy, as well as a sense of powerlessness amongst voters that is leading them to consider more extreme actions in their politics as the situation unfolds. The next slide, please. We call this climate fatalism, because almost half of respondents believe there is nothing that their countries can or should do that might risk losing jobs. There's a concern around the effects that fighting climate change might have in terms of how wages could go down, how unemployment could be increased. There's not that strong a belief that green new jobs is as viable a future as many on the liberal side of politics might desire for this. And so that's a real worry in terms of making a more green politics for the future. The next slide, please. Here's an advantage, though, because when it comes to the global green jobs race, there is a willingness to accept the idea that an early investment in green industries and technology could provide a competitive advantage to countries in the future. There's a broader political point here, which is that voters are more willing than we've seen in a long time to embrace a politics of, to be blunt, self-interest. Self-interest for themselves and their communities, self-interest for their countries. If you can say that green jobs are going to mean that your country comes out on top economically, then even in Germany, we see 35% support for a belief that early action on climate change could lead to an economic advantage in the future. That's a critical argument to consider in making the case for a greener future. Next, please. Investment in the balance. The public is split on whether to spend more. We see this in country after country. There's a partisan split between left and right. There's a 50-50 split, whichever way you construct this. In general, voters want to see more action taken on issues like infrastructure, issues like public health, issues like public education. But when it comes to the question of whether or not we can afford those investments, there's a very much classic split between it's time to invest versus it's time to save. Next, please. That comes to the question of paying for the pandemic. Fairness here is critical. Whether or not the burden of the pandemic's costs should be paid for by individuals or by those who are wealthy or large corporations isn't up for dispute. People on average incomes should not pay for this pandemic's cost. That's considered unfair by 71% of voters. That's remarkable. On the other hand, there's 64% support for large online retailers like Amazon's, or 70% support across the G7 and Australia for multinationals paying their fair share, particularly through closing tax loopholes. Next, please. And here's the question of Biden's leadership opportunity and the challenge. Because outside of the US, which remains somewhat divided, as you can see, there is a great deal of support for the Biden agenda. Here we polled the question of whether or not the idea of spending $2 trillion on infrastructure, healthcare, and renewable energy should be paid for by a tax on corporate profits to help make the economy and society greener and fairer and more globally competitive. 69% support for that global agenda. Tellingly, though, in America, and this is important, 90% of Biden's voters supporting this agenda, but really importantly, 19% of Trump voters supporting this agenda as well. And that's how President Biden enjoys the kind of approval ratings he has today. I think that wraps it up, and we'll go to Matt for some political reflections on all of this, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Look, I think you've given us a fantastic overview there. There is, as you say, a wealth of data for us to look at. We would be delighted to share the raw data with all of you in the Progressive Network so that you can dig down and do your own deeper analyses, whether that's into country-specific situations, whether that's on particular themes, or looking at particular demographic groups. So please don't hesitate to contact us at Global Progress or via our German partners, Das Progressive Zentrum, if you'd like to learn more about the survey or indeed get the data. Thank you very much.
Thank you.